Hey, Faith family, I hope all is well with you, and I hope you've been enjoying our time together in the book of John, learning so much about Jesus. And this week we conclude our series on blind spots with a comparison of spiritual sight versus spiritual blindness. As Pastor David continues in John chapter 9 with the story of Jesus healing a man born blind, we find Jesus again speaking with a man and a group of Pharisees. And as the former blind man yet again accepts Christ as Lord, the Pharisees question Jesus as if they're blind. Jesus explains briefly that if they were not blind, they would not remain in sin, yet they do. And as we will learn, the spiritually blind are that way because their minds can't comprehend what Christ does for them. We can see this in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 3 through 5. It says this, "But if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we are not proclaiming ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake." Reading this passage, our hearts are drawn to the mysterious dynamics of spiritual sight and the transformative power of the gospel. The first thing I want you to see in this passage is the veil of spiritual blindness. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 3, it says, "But if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing." And Paul introduced us to the mysterious concept of the veiled gospel and God's profound message of redemption that remains concealed to those who are perishing in unbelief. The veil represents a barrier to understanding and receiving the transforming truth of the gospel. And in John 9, we encounter a blind man who receives both physical and spiritual sight through his encounter with Jesus. The Pharisees, on the other hand, had to remain spiritually blind, unable to recognize Jesus as the source of light. And this is a vivid illustration of the spiritual veil that obscures the truth from those who reject Jesus. In verse 4, Paul unveils the culprit behind the veiling. It's not him, it's not the Lord, but it's the God of this world. In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. This adversary blinds the minds of unbelievers, preventing them from seeing the radiant light of the gospel that reveals the glory of Christ. The veil's purpose is to obstruct their spiritual vision. The Pharisees' rejection of his message indicates their allegiance to the God of this world. Their blindness is not merely a lack of physical sight, but a spiritual condition that stems from their refusal to acknowledge Jesus as the source of divine light. The second thing I want you to see in this passage is the radiance of Christ's gospel. If you look in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 5, it says, "For we are not proclaiming ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake." Paul underscores the heart of our ministry, the proclamation of Jesus as Lord. Our message is not self-centered, but Christ-centered, emphasizing His authority and His majesty and His redemptive work. And Paul and his companions consider themselves servants for the sake of Christ, echoing Jesus' own servant-hearted ministry. And the blind man's journey of faith culminates in this proclamation of Jesus as Lord. This confession encapsulates the essence of Christ-centered proclamation that Paul speaks of. The man's transformation from blindness to sight parallels the unveiling of the gospel's radiance. So Paul, he draws a parallel between God's creative act in Genesis and the spiritual illumination brought about by the gospel. Look with me in verse 6, it says, "For God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ." Just as God commanded light to shine in the darkness of creation, He also commanded the light of His truth to shine in the darkness of our hearts, revealing the knowledge of His glory. The blind man's encounter with Jesus marks a transformative moment of divine illumination, and his physical sight is restored and his spiritual eyes are open to recognize Jesus as the Son of Man. So what about you? Do you understand the significance of spiritual sight? The gospel pierces through the veil of blindness and revealing the glory of Christ and inviting us into a life of proclamation and authentic servanthood. Can you, like the blind man, declare with conviction that Jesus is Lord and let His light shine brightly through you? Paul's charge to proclaim Christ aligns with the blind man's bold testimony. Despite facing opposition and doubt, the man fearlessly declares his newfound sight and faith in Jesus. Is your servanthood a response to the transformation that you have experienced? The blind man's transformation leads him to worship Jesus, illustrating the natural response of a heart enlightened by the gospel.